In 24 hours, a rope will burn the skin of a man the British call the most dangerous terrorist in Kenya. The prison chaplain will offer a final prayer. The guards will tighten the noose, and a name whispered in the forests of Mount Kenya will be reduced in the official logbook to a single cold word: executed. That man is Dedan Kimathi, and he did not begin his life with a rifle in his hands. He began barefoot, carrying a schoolbook almost as heavy as his dreams. To understand how a quiet boy from the hills became the face of a rebellion that terrified an empire, we have to wind time back, decades, before the gallows, before the manhunt, before the coded messages scratched in notebooks, back to when the land itself was being stolen acre by acre, and a child watched fences grow where his people's stories once roamed free. He is born in 1920, in Tetu, in the Nyeri highlands of central Kenya. The air is thin and cold there, the mornings white with mist. Around his home, the soil is dark and rich, the kind of soil that makes coffee trees grow wild and fat. But the best land no longer belongs to the people who have lived on it for generations. It belongs to a tiny group of European settlers, protected by the Union Jack flying over government offices far away in Nairobi. For the young Dedan, this is not a slogan about colonialism. It is the shape of his daily life. On one side of a barbed wire fence, a white settler rides a horse, inspecting long lines of coffee bushes. On the other side, his mother bends over a strip of overworked ground, coaxing food out of tired soil with bare hands. One man owns hundreds of acres he cannot even see in a day. A whole family clings to a patch of earth so small that every drought feels like a death sentence. His father dies when he is still young. In a world already tilted against them, that loss tilts it further. His mother, Wambui, becomes the center of his universe. Small, wiry, relentless. She works on European farms, takes whatever casual jobs she can, and in the evenings she tells stories of the time when the Kikuyu roamed the hills freely, when land was passed from ancestors to grandchildren, not auctioned in government offices with English-language deeds. For Dedan, these stories land like accusations. If the land once belonged to his people, why are they now begging to rent it back? He is not the only boy asking questions. In another village on the slopes of Mount Kenya, another child is being shaped by the same hunger and the same humiliation. His name is Stanley Mathenge. Where Dedan is wiry and intense, Stanley will grow up broad-shouldered, with the easy swagger of a soldier. One day, they will compete for the loyalty of the same fighters in the same dark forest, each convinced that he alone knows how to defeat the empire. But for now, they are just boys under the same colonial sky, feeling the same weight pressing down on their futures. School is Dedan's first escape route. The Church of Scotland mission stands like an outpost of another world. Iron roofs, straight lines, a bell that summons children not to the rhythm of the seasons, but to the rhythm of a timetable. To get there, he walks through fields where African boys his age are already working, bent double in the rows, watched by European overseers with whips coiled casually at their sides. Every morning, he passes a future he refuses to accept. Inside the classroom, the chalk on the blackboard looks like magic. Letters become words, words become ideas, and ideas, he begins to suspect, can become weapons. The Bible he is given speaks of justice, of the meek inheriting the earth. Yet outside the classroom, the meek cannot even inherit their father's land. This contradiction starts as a discomfort in his chest. It will grow into a fury. He is clever, very clever. He absorbs English, excels at composition, takes pride in every neat line he writes. But he is also restless and proud. When he sees unfairness, he talks back. To teachers, to supervisors, to anyone who thinks a rigid rule is more important than a human being. In a system built on obedience, his stubborn conscience is a criminal defect. He gets into trouble. He answers too sharply, challenges punishments he thinks are unjust. At first, it's warnings, then it's beatings, then expulsions. Not once, several times. The gate to opportunity swings open in front of him and slams in his face again and again, sometimes because he cannot keep silent. In the presence of injustice, sometimes because he simply cannot bear to bow his head and pretend not to see. Each expulsion is a small humiliation, but each is also a lesson. The rules of colonial Kenya are not written only in law books. They are written on the bodies of Africans who kneel when they are told to stand, and stand when they are told to kneel. If he obeys, there will be a place for him, small, cramped, safe. If he refuses, there will be a price. He tries to fit himself into the small spaces the system allows. He works as a casual laborer on settler farms, watching men his father's age be ordered around by boys barely older than he is, simply because one has white skin and the other does not. He becomes a clerk for a time, seeing the inside of offices where land, freedom, and human beings are turned into numbers on paper. He signs up as an askari, a soldier in the King's African Rifles, thinking that maybe if he serves the empire, it will allow him to rise. That is the twist the empire never sees coming. The more closely he touches the machinery of British power, the more clearly he sees its rusted teeth. In the army, he discovers discipline and weapons. He also discovers humiliation. African soldiers shouted at, slapped, made to crawl on the ground for amusement. He learns that courage displayed in the service of the king will never make him truly equal to even the most mediocre white officer. History will not record every insult, every sting of injustice, but they accumulate in him like gunpowder. He is discharged from the army. Officially, the reasons are simple: trouble with discipline, inability to fully submit, perhaps a medical note. Unofficially, he is the kind of man a colonial army does not want to keep close. Intelligent, observant, unwilling to accept his place. The uniform comes off. The knowledge it left in his muscles, the weight of a rifle, the logic of patrols, remains. Around this time, in a different uniform, Stanley Mathenge is moving in a different direction through the same system. He will stay longer with the King's African Rifles, absorb more of its methods, learn how British officers plan, strike, and retreat. He will see war in Ethiopia, feel the adrenaline of battle, taste the bitter mix of loyalty and resentment. When he eventually steps away, he will carry with him not just anger, but a soldier's cold calculation. 2 men, 2 paths, 1 destiny, to turn the empire's own lessons against it. But only one can truly lead the armed struggle that is coming. While this future rivalry sharpens in silence, the land crisis ripping through central Kenya intensifies. European settlers expand. African reserves shrink. The colonial government introduces pass laws and tightens hut taxes. Chiefs loyal to the administration are given power to allocate land and enforce orders. Those who resist are flogged, imprisoned, or pushed onto the worst soil. In Nyeri, young men gather in the edges of fields, in churchyards after services, in crowded rooms lit by smoking kerosene lamps. They talk quietly at first, about unfair taxes, about brutal foremen, about the arrogance of the Wazungu, who seize land and then demand loyalty. The name of a new organization passes from mouth to mouth: the Kenya African Union, KAU. It is the first legal political movement that dares to say out loud what everyone feels. The land must be returned, the people must govern themselves. When KAU argues for peaceful change, petitions, delegations, letters to London, some are hopeful, but as the years pass, the British answer remains the same. Wait, be patient. Reform takes time. Meanwhile, evictions continue, and the police crack down on even moderate gatherings. The gap between polite words and brutal reality becomes unbearable. Somewhere between those two worlds, Dedan stands, torn. He teaches for a while, writes, preaches in churches, trying to awaken minds with words. His notebooks fill with scripture, with speeches, with plans. He wears shirts carefully pressed, as if order on the outside can impose order on a world spinning out of control. When he looks at himself in a mirror, he still sees a man who might live a respectable life within the system. Perhaps as a teacher, a clerk, a minor leader. But outside, the countdown has already started. By now it is the late 1940s. The war in Europe is over. British soldiers have returned home to parades and medals. In Kenya, African veterans return to overcrowded reserves and signs that say, Europeans only. They have fought fascism abroad, only to find a quieter, more bureaucratic version of it ruling their own villages. A dangerous question burns behind their eyes. If we were good enough to die for the empire, why are we not good enough to share power with it? The colonial government hears the murmurs and responds the way it knows best. With laws, with police, with files. Names of troublemakers go into cabinets. Informers are paid to attend meetings, to sit at the back of churches, to listen in on whispered conversations at markets. Each day that passes, another sheet of paper with a name like Kimathi, Dedan, or Mathenge Stanley slides into a folder marked in red. That is the real clock ticking over Dedan's head. Not the one that will one day count down his final 24 hours, but the one that counts how many days remain before his name. moves from suspected agitator to enemy of the state. He does not see those files, but he feels the pressure. Friends disappear. Political meetings are raided. Rumors spread of detention camps being prepared. Inside Cow, the debate grows fierce. One group insists that they must continue to petition, to argue, to use the language of the British themselves. Rights, democracy, negotiation. Another group, quieter but harder, begins to talk about oaths, about secret organizations, about the necessity of force. It is in these shadowed corners that Dedan and Stanley will eventually meet. Eye to eye, each measuring the other not as a friend, but as a potential rival for the hearts of the angry and the dispossessed. For now, they hear of each other as rumors. Mathenj, the ex-soldier, the man who knows guns. Kimathi, the writer, the preacher who can make a crowd tremble. The movement that will later be called Mau Mau is still nameless, more feeling than structure, but it is taking shape through oaths sworn over cups of goat blood, through pledges made in forests at midnight, through secrets passed from hut to hut. The first trees of the Aberdare and Mount Kenya forests are already hiding men who have slipped away from wage labor and police patrols. The bush is becoming a sanctuary and a training ground. One evening, after yet another story of a family driven from its land by a settler with papers stamped by a government official who never set foot in their village, Dedan reaches a breaking point. He looks at his own hands, calloused but still those of a teacher, a clerk, a man of words. He thinks of the Bible verses about justice that he has recited so many times. He thinks of the fences, the files, the polished boots of policemen who push old men aside without a second glance. He realizes words alone will not break those boots. When the invitation comes to attend a secret gathering, he does not hesitate. The meeting is in a hut at the edge of a forest, far from the main paths, guarded by men who watch the darkness with sharp eyes and hidden blades. Inside, the air is thick with sweat and smoke. Faces he knows from markets and church pews look different here, lit by the flicker of a single lamp. Harder, more determined, some filled with fear, others with something like relief. There is an oath. There is a cup. There is the understanding that once he drinks, there is no going back. He listens to the words of the leaders, some cautious, some fiery. He hears of plans to refuse work on settler farms, to sabotage roads, to steal weapons. He hears, between the lines, that a future of negotiation is closing and a future of war is opening. Every second of hesitation feels like another grain of sand slipping through an hourglass, controlled by men in colonial uniforms. When the cup reaches him, his hand does not shake, not outwardly. In that moment, the serious, stubborn boy from Tetu steps across an invisible line. He is no longer just a restless teacher, or a former soldier, or a clever clerk. He is now part of a secret army, forming under the canopy of the forest. An army that will soon need commanders, strategists, visionaries. An army that will not accept half freedom or half land. Somewhere not far away, perhaps on the other side of the same forest, Stanley Mathenj is also making choices. His path, too, is bending toward the bush. The empire has trained them both. The land has enraged them both. The people will soon demand that one of them lead, and that the other follow or be pushed aside. For the British authorities, the countdown to emergency has already begun. For Dedan, a different countdown starts that night, in the dim hut with the secret oath. The countdown to the day he will walk away, from the last scraps of a safe, ordinary life, and vanish into the trees with a gun on his shoulder and a price on his head. The rope in Kimathi prison is still years away, but its shadow, long and thin, has just fallen across his path. In another life, Dedan Kimathi would be standing at a blackboard, chalk in hand, arguing with a stubborn pupil about a line of scripture. In this one, he is crawling through wet mountain grass, a homemade rifle pressed to his chest, while a British searchlight combs the dark just a few hundred meters away. He has less than 6 hours until dawn, less than 6 hours to move his men, hide their tracks, and disappear back into the forest before the ring of soldiers closes. The boy who once fought with teachers is now fighting time itself, and in the trees above him, two futures grind against each other, one in which he becomes the undisputed commander of a liberation army, and one in which the same rope waiting in Kimathi prison finds his neck years too early. When he first steps into the forest after taking the oath, it is not as a hero. It is as a stranger. The forest is cold, wet, and indifferent. It does not care about speeches or petitions. It cares about silence, patience, and knowing which plants will burn your throat if you eat them. The first nights, he shivers under branches that drip icy water onto his face. Every sound sounds like a patrol. Every shadow looks like a traitor. The men he finds there are angry, brave, and utterly disorganized. Some are farmhands who walked off settler estates with nothing but pangas and stubbornness. Some are veterans of the king's African rifles, like ghosts of an old war who have wandered into a new one. Others are thieves who see in the chaos a chance to become something grander than criminals. They call themselves fighters, forest men, sometimes the army. But if you strip away the oath and the slogans, what remains is simple: hungry men with guns and no single plan. Kimathi watches them argue over food, over women, over who gets the one decent rifle captured in a raid. He sees men break the oath in small ways, stealing from villagers who support them, settling old grudges with the point of a knife. Every breach feels like a crack in the foundation of something that hasn't even been fully built. He could walk away, go back to town, hide among the thousands of frustrated young men who complain in whispers and keep their heads down when the police walk past. But the emergency changes everything. In October 1952, after the assassination of senior chief Waruhiu, a loyal servant of the colonial government, the British declare a state of emergency. The words themselves sound calm, administrative, almost tidy. The reality is not. Police trucks scream through the streets at night, doors are kicked in, men are dragged from beds in front of their families. Operation Jock Scott, they call it. A neat name for the first storm. Hundreds of suspected activists are seized in a few days. The legal leaders of the land movement, the men who believed in petitions and conferences, are swept up and locked away. Jomo Kenyatta is arrested, paraded as the face of Mau Mau, and put on trial. The message is clear. The age of polite argument is over. In Nairobi, in Nyeri, in the crowded villages of central Kenya, people stare at the empty chairs of those taken and understand something terrible and simple. The British have decapitated the legal movement. The only leaders who cannot be reached by warrant, who cannot be served papers and dragged to court, are the ones who are already in the forest. Overnight, the scattered bands in the hills become more than gangs of fugitives. They become the last visible hope of resistance. And hope in a time of terror has a price. The British do not yet know it, but at the same moment they congratulate themselves for arresting Kenyatta. Another kind of leader is beginning to form far from any courtroom. A thin man with sharp eyes and a worn notebook in his pocket is walking from camp to camp under the dripping canopy, listening, watching, judging. That man is Kimathi, and he has competition. The first time he meets Stanley Mathenge in the forest, it feels less like a reunion of comrades and more like two storms colliding. The meeting takes place in a clearing, ringed with trees so dense they look like walls. Men stand on the edges, rifles slung, bodies tense. No one is entirely sure whether this is a council or the beginning of a fight. Mathenge arrives with a file of men who move like soldiers, not fugitives. Their boots land in unison. Some wear pieces of old military kit, a belt, a jacket, a cap, that hint at their past in the King's African rifles. Their rifles are kept clean, their formation tight. When they fan out, they do it with the ease of men who have drilled this movement 100 times before. Kimathi watches him step into the clearing, broad-shouldered, confident, eyes that scan every angle, measuring distances to cover as if his mind is permanently mapping battlefields. Where Kimathi carries a notebook, Mathenge carries the memory of real war. For a moment, each man sees in the other what he is missing. For a moment, they almost respect each other. Then the moment passes, and the rivalry begins. The fighters call the gathering a conference, but it is as much a test of loyalty as it is a strategic meeting. They argue over where to strike, hit settler farms to frighten the colonists, or target police posts to capture more weapons. They argue over discipline, execute suspected informers quickly, or risk keeping them alive in hopes they can be turned. A man can step into a forest as a rumor and walk out as a government's nightmare. In 1952, the British will swear they are facing bandits, yet the truth is harsher. They are facing an organized, disciplined, almost religious war machine, and it is about to acquire a commander who writes orders like scripture and signs them with a name that spreads like fire: Dedan Kimathi. He thinks he still has time. The movement thinks it still has time. But somewhere in Nairobi, on a polished desk under a framed portrait of the king, a file is being stamped and restamped until the ink becomes destiny. And when that stamp finally lands, Kimathi will have only one narrow window to become the leader he believes Kenya needs. Before his rival seizes the forest first, because while Kimathi is taking the oath, another man is already moving through the same darkness with a soldier's confidence. Stanley Mathenge, broader shoulders, easier smile, a talent for command that feels natural, almost effortless. Men follow him because he looks like victory. And in a rebellion, image can be a weapon as sharp as any machete. The oath changes everything, but not in the way Kimathi expects. At first, the army is more nerve than structure. Scattered cells, whispered plans, a handful of stolen rifles, homemade shotguns, pangas sharpened on stones. Messages travel by word of mouth and by crumpled notes passed inside baskets of sweet potatoes. A meeting can be a prayer gathering one day and a weapons discussion the next. In the villages of Nyeri and Muranga, the air itself feels watched. Informers sit in the shade, listening with polite faces. Police trucks appear on roads where they never used to come. At night, footsteps pause outside huts, then move on. Kimathi is quickly pulled into the work that fits him best. Words that harden into commands. He writes, he organizes. He drills discipline into men who have lived their whole lives under discipline forced by someone else. But there is a difference between obeying a whip and obeying a cause. And Kimathi understands that difference in his bones. If the fighters are to survive, they cannot just be angry. They must be precise. He starts to build something that feels dangerous to even the movement's own elders. An internal code. Rules. Ranks, punishments. Not because he loves control, but because a rebellion without order is a bonfire that burns bright and dies fast. And the pressure keeps rising. In Nairobi, the Kenya African Union is still trying to speak the language of petitions and commissions. Jomo Kenyatta's name is on everyone's lips, like a key that might unlock the future without blood. But in the ridges, men are no longer discussing if violence will come. They're discussing the practicalities, where to hide food, how to smuggle ammunition, which loyalist chief can be turned, and which must be removed. That word, removed, begins to mean death. In the forests of the Abadas and Mount Kenya, the first camps become permanent. The bush stops being a hiding place and becomes a headquarters. Smoke from cooking fires is buried under thick leaves, so it won't betray them to aircraft. Lookouts are placed on ridgelines with signals worked out in advance. Bird calls, whistles, stones stacked in unnatural shapes. The rebellion is learning to live like a hunted animal, and hunted animals become extremely good at sensing the snap of a twig. Kimathi's reputation grows because he does not speak like a man making noise. He speaks like a man building a state in miniature. He insists on oath discipline. He demands secrecy. He pushes for the acquisition of firearms, not just blades. He starts issuing written directives, an unusual, almost shocking thing in a guerrilla movement many expect to be purely oral and improvised. Some fighters are awed, others are unnerved. Written orders can be captured. A notebook can become a death sentence. Kimathi answers that fear coldly. If they can't risk paper, they can't risk freedom. But where Kimathi builds with tight, intense focus, Mathenge wins with charisma and battlefield confidence. In the camps, men talk. They compare. They choose sides in quiet ways. Who they visit, who they carry messages for, whose name they invoke when they swear loyalty. The rivalry is not yet open, but it is already shaping the forest like a fault line under pressure. Then comes the spark that turns pressure into explosion. By 1952, the colonial government is terrified, not because it understands the Mau Mau, but because it doesn't. It sees shadows moving beyond the edge of its intelligence reports. It hears of oathing ceremonies spreading through the reserves like an epidemic. It sees police stations attacked in isolated places. It hears whispers that some African policemen have sympathies, that some home guards might turn their rifles the other way at the crucial moment. The settler community, sitting on stolen land like a man sleeping on dynamite, demands force. And force is exactly what the British know how to deliver. October 1952. The state of emergency is declared. On paper, it is bureaucracy, regulations, detentions, curfews. In reality, it is a giant steel trap slamming shut. Overnight, roads fill with checkpoints. Villages are raided before dawn. Men are dragged out of huts into cold air and made to squat in lines while names are read from lists. Some names are wrong. Some names are guessed. Some names are chosen because settling scores is easy when the law is a club. And the most chilling part is how fast it happens. 1 week, you are a political organizer. The next, you are a terrorist, and the state can swallow you without trial. The government arrests Kenyatta and other nationalist leaders in a mass sweep meant to cut the head off the movement. But in the ridges, that sweep does something the British do not anticipate. It convinces thousands that peaceful politics has been strangled in its crib. If petitions lead to prison, then the forest becomes parliament. The emergency also creates a brutal countdown for Kimathi. The bush is about to flood with recruits, and whoever structures them first will control the rebellion's future. If he hesitates, Mathenge, already admired, already seen as the natural commander, will become the unquestioned face of armed struggle. Kimathi moves. He disappears deeper into the forest, and when he re-emerges, it is no longer as a participant. It is as a leader with a system. He begins formalizing units, assigning responsibilities, enforcing rules against indiscipline. He pushes for coordinated strikes, raids for weapons, ambushes on patrols, intimidation of collaborators. He understands something simple and cruel. Without rifles, the rebellion is a story. With rifles, it becomes a negotiation conducted at gunpoint. The forests begin to echo with training. Not parade ground marching, something harsher, quieter, movement without silhouettes, night navigation, patrol patterns, how to melt into elephant grass when aircraft pass overhead, how to strip a captured rifle in the dark, fingers working by memory. And now the conflict stops being abstract. It becomes personal, village by village, family by family. Home guards are formed, African auxiliaries armed by the British to protect loyalist chiefs and settlers, to patrol the reserves, to hunt terrorists. For the colonial administration, it is an efficient strategy. Make Africans fight Africans. For communities, it is a nightmare of suspicion. A man you grew up with might now be wearing a uniform and carrying a government rifle. A cousin might be reporting names. A neighbor might be forced into it, terrified, trapped between two violent authorities. Kimathi understands the psychological war better than most. He knows the British aren't just fighting with bullets, they're fighting with fear. So he answers with his own fear, carefully targeted. Threats to collaborators, warnings to chiefs, orders that make examples. This is where the rebellion hardens, and where Kimathi's moral universe starts narrowing into something frighteningly absolute. Because leadership in the forest is not gentle. It is scarcity, paranoia, and consequence. One captured messenger can unravel an entire network. One careless campfire can bring an aerial bombardment. One undisciplined fighter can rape or steal and poison the movement's legitimacy. Kimathi reacts by tightening control further. He issues edicts. No looting without authorization, no violence against civilians without cause, no betrayal. Punishments are not symbolic. They are final. Some men admire him more, some begin to fear him, and fear again becomes a weapon. But Mathenge is not standing still. Mathenge's camps draw fighters who want action now, men who prefer a commander who laughs, slaps backs, and then leads a raid that ends with rifles captured and songs sung over the spoils. His legend grows in a different direction, the general who can't be caught. His name becomes the answer when young recruits ask who will lead them to glory. And for a moment it seems plausible that Kimathi might become the movement's strict ideologue, while Mathenge becomes its military star. Kimathi cannot allow that. Not because he wants vanity, but because he believes the struggle will collapse if it becomes a competition of personalities rather than a chain of command. And yet that is exactly what it is becoming. Two gravitational centers pulling the same desperate men. The rivalry turns sharper after raids begin to succeed. A police post is hit in the night. Rifles vanish. An ambush leaves a patrol scattered. Then the British respond with a sweep so brutal that it leaves behind burned huts and bleeding elders. In the aftermath, fighters argue in whispers. Whose plan was better? Whose security was tighter? Whose retreat route saved more lives? Every success becomes a political asset. Every failure becomes a liability. Kimathi begins to craft not just tactics, but myth. He writes proclamations. He frames the struggle in moral, almost prophetic terms. Land and freedom, yes, but also purification, loyalty, destiny. His messages are passed like relics. Men repeat his phrases as if repeating them might make hunger less sharp. The British, meanwhile, begin to understand the shape of what they face, and it horrifies them. This is not a single gang. It is a mobile, networked insurgency rooted in the grievances of land and humiliation. So they escalate. Detention camps expand. Interrogations become routine and vicious. Screening operations sort whole communities by suspicion. Villages are forcibly reorganized, herded into guarded settlements, what will later be called villagization, to cut the forest fighters off from food and intelligence. The idea is simple: starve the fish by draining the water. In the forest, this hits like a silent bomb. Supply lines dry up. Families who once smuggled maize and medicine now live behind fences, watched by home guards. The fighters begin to feel the new reality. The British are not just hunting them. They are reshaping the country around them, building a Kenya designed to make the forest irrelevant. And that creates the most dangerous kind of desperation. Kimathi reacts by pushing for bigger actions. Operations that will force the colonial government to bleed publicly, to look weak, to make settlers panic. But bigger actions mean more risk, more exposure, more chances for betrayal. And betrayal is everywhere now, because the British have discovered another weapon more effective than bullets. Rewards. Cash, protection, immunity, food, a chance to step out of the hunger and fear and return to the villages alive. Kimathi begins to suspect everyone. He must, because if he doesn't, his camp will wake up surrounded. Then the twist he never expects arrives from within the movement itself. A group of fighters, exhausted by discipline and afraid of the tightening net, starts quietly shifting allegiance. Some drift toward Mathenj, who seems more flexible, more human. Some simply want to survive. Kimathi interprets this as weakness at best, treason at worst. His circle tightens, orders become harsher, loyalty tests multiply. The forest, once a place of refuge, becomes a place where a wrong word can get you killed. Not by the British, but by your own side. At the same time, the British intelligence picture begins to sharpen around Kimathi. Reports describe him as educated, fanatical, organized. They start to see him not as one rebel among many, but as a possible linchpin. His name moves upward on lists. Bounties rise. Patrols are instructed to prioritize his capture. His face begins to circulate in whispered descriptions and sketchy photographs. Slim, intense eyes, always moving, often in a leopard. Skin mantle that turns him into a symbol as much as a man. Kimathi senses the shift. He feels the net tightening, not only because the patrols increase, but because the forest itself changes sound. More aircraft, more distant gunfire, more sudden silence after birds scatter. He starts sleeping in shorter bursts, moving camp more frequently, writing less but thinking more. Every decision becomes weighted with the lives of men who look at him like he is the struggle itself. And the countdown becomes explicit. A message reaches him, intelligence from the ridges, that a major sweep is planned. Not a routine patrol, a coordinated operation meant to break the Central Forest Command structure within weeks. Weeks, not years, not someday. Weeks. Kimathi now has a limited window to do something that will decide whether he becomes the unquestioned commander or merely one more hunted figure swallowed by the emergency. He must unify the armed struggle under a single chain of command before the British crush the camps, or before Mathenj consolidates power and leaves Kimathi isolated. He takes a gamble. Kimathi begins reaching outward, attempting to pull scattered factions into a centralized structure to formalize command in a way that can survive sweeps and betrayals. This is not romantic. It is ugly administration done under rain and hunger. Names are recorded, units are numbered, orders are copied and redistributed. Couriers run through dangerous ridges with messages tucked into hollowed sticks. Meetings are held at night under trees that drip cold water onto shoulders like constant reminders of exposure. And at the center of it all is Kimathi's dangerous belief that discipline will save them. Mathenj views this differently. In his view, the forest is not a bureaucracy. It is a battlefield. Flexibility is survival. Charisma is cohesion. He cultivates loyalty not through paperwork and codes, but through shared raids, shared danger, shared laughter around a fire that could get them killed. The rivalry is now unavoidable. Men start choosing sides openly, not in speeches, by where they sleep, whose orders they obey, who they call general. One night, a messenger arrives at Kimathi's camp with news that feels like a blade slid between ribs. Mathenj is consolidating influence in a key sector, drawing fighters away, presenting himself as the true military head. It is not just ambition. It is a challenge to Kimathi's legitimacy, and Kimathi knows that if he loses this contest, he may still fight the British, but he will fight as a diminished man, vulnerable to both enemy patrols and internal erosion. Kimathi's response is swift and severe. He issues directives meant to reassert authority, and he sends trusted men to secure allegiance in contested areas. It is the moment where the anti-colonial war begins to carry a shadow war inside it. A war for control of the revolution itself. Outside the forest, the emergency rages. Detentions swell, brutality becomes routine, and the British, eager for a symbolic victory, begin to broadcast a narrative. They will end Mau Mau by capturing its leaders. They are right, but not in the way they think. Because the more they hunt Kimathi, the more he becomes inevitable. His name becomes a magnet for fear and hope. Settlers say it with hatred. Fighters say it like a prayer. Villagers say it with a quick glance over the shoulder to see who is listening. He is no longer a man. He is a moving deadline. And he feels it. Each day as food thins, each night as sentries listen for boots, each time a courier fails to return. The state of emergency has made the forest smaller. The rivalry with Mathenge has made it sharper. The British sweeps have made it lethal. Kimathi has weeks to cement authority, protect supply lines, and strike hard enough to keep the movement from fracturing. Before the operation hits, before betrayal finds him, before hunger slows his legs, before Mathenge's legend swallows his own, the rope in Kimathi prison is still not visible. But in 1952, the noose begins to take shape. Not from hemp, but from paper files, reward posters, and the tightening circle of men, with rifles who are being trained, very calmly, to end one name. Dedan Kimathi steps deeper into the trees anyway, because once the emergency begins, there is no such thing as backing out, only choosing how and when you are caught. On the ridge, under a sky that keeps lighting up with British flares, a man in a leopard skin cloak bends over a scrap of paper. Every few minutes the darkness explodes white, the forest becomes a negative photograph, and in that brief flash he can see everything. That might kill him. The steep drop to his left, the tree line to his right, the silhouettes of his own sentries, frozen like statues. He has 48 hours. 48 hours before a massive sweep hits these hills. 48 hours to turn scattered bands of hungry fighters into something the British will be forced to call by a name they fear: an army. The man is called a terrorist in colonial reports. In whispers in the villages, he is called Field Marshal. Even before the title is officially his real name is Dedan Kimathi, and in the next 2 days, he has to do the work of a government that doesn't exist yet. He finishes the line he's writing, presses the paper flat against his knee, and signs it with a flourish that is more stubborn than grand. D. Wachiuri for Kenya Land and Freedom. No one has declared that organization yet. In this moment, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army exists only as ink in the dark, in a forest that the British insist belongs to the Crown. Kimathi is about to prove them wrong by acting as if his army already exists and daring the world to catch up. The days leading to this moment are a blur of movement and calculation. Couriers arriving soaked to the bone, delivering messages in breathless murmurs. Scouts drawing maps with sticks in the mud. Whispers that the British are preparing something bigger than anything before. A coordinated offensive that will squeeze the Abadas and mount Kenya like a fist. The countdown is not just military, it is personal. If Kimathi fails to unify the fighters now, the British offensive will not hit a single army. It will smash a dozen small, isolated groups, each one brave, each one doomed. If he fails, the name Kimathi will be a footnote in the reports of a rebellion quickly contained. If he succeeds, he will not just lead raids, he will lead a war. There is one obstacle he cannot ignore: Stanley Mathenge. In the camps, men talk about them the way you'd talk about two rival kings in the same kingdom. Mathenge, the seasoned soldier, the battlefield genius, the man whose laughter before a raid settles nerves. Kimathi, the intense organizer, the writer of codes, the man whose eyes can make you feel blessed or condemned in the same heartbeat. Their conflict is no longer a whisper. It is a choice every fighter must make. The plan taking shape in Kimathi's mind is dangerous precisely because it makes that choice unavoidable. He wants to call a council, not just another meeting in a clearing, but a gathering that feels like a constitutional convention under the trees. There he intends to push one idea so hard it will either bind the movement or rupture it completely. A single named army with a defined command, a code, and a leader whose authority is not negotiable. And he wants that leader to be himself. The urgency is not theoretical. Reports keep reaching him of British strikes that feel more coordinated, more informed, almost eerily precise. A patrol that walks straight toward a supposedly secret path. A surprise ambush that suggests someone, somewhere, is talking. Traitors, informers, or worse, British agents who once wore the same tattered clothes as the fighters, now turned into pseudo-gangs, hunting their former comrades from the inside. Kimathi reads captured pamphlets by the light of a twig fire. Some offer money for information. Some promise amnesty to those who surrender early. One shows a rough sketch of his own face, the reward printed beneath like a price tag on his life. It is not the money that bothers him. It is the idea that somewhere, in a tiled office in Nairobi, a man with a fountain pen thinks he can buy the revolution one frightened fighter at a time. So Kimathi answers with something the British cannot buy: belief sharpened into law. In camp after camp, he arrives like a storm that speaks in paragraphs. He tells the fighters that they are no longer just forest men, or Mau Mau. They are soldiers of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. He lays down a hierarchy: platoons, companies, sectors. He outlines punishments for theft, for abuse, for betrayal, punishments that end with a rifle shot at dawn. He doesn't merely speak, he writes. Orders, regulations, oaths repeated with terrifying seriousness. Men who grew up under chiefs appointed by the colonial government now find themselves standing at attention as Kimathi, in his patched uniform and leopard skin mantle, reads out rules he has composed himself. For a second it feels like something impossible is happening. A government made of mud, hunger and conviction. Mathenge watches all this with arms folded, eyes narrowed. He cannot deny the results. Kimathi's sectors begin to move with more discipline. Raids are coordinated, ambushes are timed. Food is allocated, not hoarded. Villagers report feeling both safer and more afraid. Safer from random banditry, more afraid of the consequences of betrayal. But Mathenge also sees the cost. The more centralized the movement becomes, the more a single bullet, or a single informer, can shift the war. Put too much on one head, and that head becomes the obvious target. In private conversations, he mocks the growing cult around Kimathi. This is a war, not a church, he tells his officers. We need commanders, not prophets. Yet in the forest, myth is not a luxury. It is fuel, and it is about to be tested by something that will tear the heart out of central Kenya. Lari. In March 1953, loyalist chiefs and their families are massacred in a night of horror that will become one of the most infamous episodes of the emergency. Huts are set on fire, people are hacked and burned, children die screaming. The British show the world the charred bodies and say, "These are Mau Mau. This is Kimathi." The photographs are shocking, even to those who hate the colonial government. The horror is undeniable. What is less clear, even now, is how much command, how much chaos, and how much local revenge lay behind that night. For Kimathi, far in the forest, the news arrives not as a dossier, but as a jagged series of reports. A chief who was known to be brutal, a village split into factions, a decision taken in rage, and then an inferno. He is furious. Not because a loyalist chief is dead, that was always likely, because the scale and savagery hand the British a weapon more powerful than any rifle. Moral outrage. In a cramped, smoky clearing, Kimathi summons nearby sector leaders. The atmosphere is tense, defensive. We fight for land and for freedom, not for the pleasure of killing, he says, voice rising. We punish traitors, yes, but we do not become mad dogs. If we lose the people, we lose the war. Some nod, others bristle. They live with the daily reality of home guards dragging relatives from huts, of torture in interrogation centers, of chiefs who use colonial power to settle old scores. To them, Lari is not madness, it is balance. The argument will never fully resolve. But from this moment, Kimathi pushes even harder for a code that separates his army from the image painted by colonial propaganda. Violence will continue, but he tries, for as long as he can, to keep it harnessed. The British, meanwhile, double down. In April 1954, Nairobi wakes to a city under siege. Operation Anvil. Roadblocks, house searches, mass roundups. Tens of thousands of African men are herded into open spaces, screened, sorted. Some are sent to detention camps. Some are released under watch. The city becomes a net, and the holes tighten. For the forest fighters, this is a catastrophe. Nairobi has been a crucial artery: money, medicine, contacts. Now that artery is being clamped shut in a single operation that feels like a dry run for what might come next in the ridges. Kimathi reads the reports and feels the clock in his head speed up. The British have shown they can paralyze an entire city in one day. What happens when they apply that method to the highlands? to his sectors. He needs to move faster. The council he has been planning finally gathers, under conditions that border on insane. Different groups of fighters approach from different directions, traveling at night, lying flat in the grass as aircraft hum overhead. The meeting place is a hidden glade, its entrance guarded by men who would shoot their own cousins rather than let an informer through. By the time the last contingent arrives, the forest around them feels like an enormous listening ear. The arguments begin at once. Some commanders demand more brutal reprisals against loyalists. Others, burdened by the memory of Lari, beg for restraint. Mathenji's men insist that battlefield decisions must remain flexible, not bound by pages of rules. Kimathi's supporters insist that without clear command, the British will pick them off, piece by piece. At the center of it all, the rivalry becomes explicit. One elder, respected by both camps, stands and asks the question out loud. Who then leads this army? Silence falls, thick as fog. Kimathi speaks first. He does not shout. He does not pound his chest. He lists in careful, relentless detail what he has already built. The sectors, the codes, the system of couriers, the attempts to restrain random brutality, the efforts to keep fighters supplied despite villagization, arrests, hangings. We are already one army, he says quietly. We only need to admit it. Then Mathenj stands. He speaks of battles, of ambushes that worked because a commander on the ground was free to adapt, of men who follow not paper but courage. He reminds them that he trained under imperial officers and knows how they think, and how to humiliate them. They fear the man they cannot predict, he says, not the man who writes like a clerk. The air shakes with murmurs, not applause, not boos, something more dangerous. Division. The debate drags through the night, words piling up like spent shells. Outside, the countdown continues. British convoys grinding along distant roads, officers marking maps, informers whispering in canteens. The decision, when it comes, is not clean. They agree finally to the name Kimathi has been carrying in his pocket. Kenya Land and Freedom Army, KLFA. They agree to formalize sectors, to recognize ranks, to accept an overarching command. And they agree that the highest rank, Field Marshal, will go to Kimathi. It is a victory, but it is not total. Mathenj does not kneel. He does not storm off. He nods once, jaw clenched, and accepts a key command role. In words, the conflict is resolved. In hearts, it is merely buried. As dawn bleeds into the trees, Kimathi steps away from the gathering with a new weight on his shoulders. He has what he wanted. A title, a structure, the beginnings of an army that can be named in history books. He also has what he feared. A position so clear that every rifle, every informer, every British operation will now be aiming for him. From this point on, every step he takes is taken as Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. The forest hears the new title first. Soon the villages will hear it too. For a time it works. The KLFA becomes more than a slogan. It becomes a reality measured in British casualty reports and settler panic. Patrols vanish into ambushes. Roads once considered safe become corridors of dread. Home guards start requesting heavier weapons, more backup, more barbed wire. Kimathi moves like a ghost between sectors, inspecting pothole-riddled boots, counting bullets, holding impromptu courts where he listens to grievances and hands down sentences. He has become judge, general, and priest of an invisible nation. He also becomes something else, exhausted. The British adapt. Villagization accelerates. Hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru are herded into emergency villages, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Food and information that once flowed quietly into the forest now trickle, then stop. Detention camps fill. Torture becomes an unspoken policy, a routine tool. Hunger turns from background noise into strategy. Kimathi watches men grow thinner. He reads reports of families forced to choose between feeding their children inside the wire and smuggling maize out to the forest. He begins to dread each new arrival at camp, not because of what they bring, but because of what their hollow cheeks will say. Desperation sharpens both knives and suspicion. Then comes a twist no one expects. One day, word spreads through the forest like a rumor of rain. Mathenj is gone. The stories conflict. Some say he has gone north, toward Ethiopia, seeking weapons and support. Some whisper that he was led away by British agents. Others insist he is dead, his body hidden, his name kept alive as a useful legend. No one can produce proof. No one can produce Mathenji. For Kimathi, the disappearance lands like a punch he didn't see coming. The rival whose shadow has darkened every decision is suddenly absent. There is no dramatic showdown, no handshake, no formal resignation, just absence, a hole where a powerful man used to stand. The effect is paradoxical. On paper, it strengthens Kimathi. With Mathenge gone, he is the unchallenged face of the KLFA. In reality, it weakens the movement. Men who followed Mathenge out of personal loyalty feel unmoored, suspicious, sometimes bitter. Some drift away, some surrender. Some become the very pseudo-gangs the British now favor. Kimathi inherits not only command, but ghosts. He has no time to grieve the loss of an adversary who, in another world, might have been his greatest ally, because the net is tightening again. By 1955, the British are no longer pretending this is temporary. They are building a machinery of repression meant to last. Pipelines of detention, legal fictions to justify endless imprisonment, a whole vocabulary of rehabilitation that hides beatings and broken bones. A secret war inside the war begins. The war of broken men. Some fighters, tortured beyond endurance, break. They betray hideouts, paths, names. Others pretend to break, then feed false information. Trust, which was already thin, becomes threadbare. At night, around tiny fires, men ask quietly, "How long can this go on?" Kimathi's answer never changes. "Until we win, or we are all dead." But his private thoughts are darker. He knows that total victory, driving the British into the sea with bush rifles, is unlikely. What he is really fighting for now is time and moral leverage. Enough years of resistance, enough blood and cost, that Britain will one day decide it is easier to negotiate independence than to continue this grinding war. To buy that time, he must stay alive. Personally, he starts changing patterns. Never sleep in the same place twice. Never let anyone know his full schedule. Move with a smaller guard, then with no guard, then with a different guard. He becomes, in effect, a fugitive from his own fame. Yet fame keeps catching up. The colonial government inflates his legend as much as his supporters do, using his name to justify wider crackdowns. Secret memos talk about him as the key figure. Reward posters for him go up in market centers, leaning on hunger and fear. At the same time, in the villages, children whisper his name as if it might protect them. Old women, forced into barbed wire villages, murmur prayers for our sons in the forest that sound suspiciously like prayers for him. He is one man in a rough uniform, sleeping in sodden blankets under trees that drip all night. But to both sides, he has become a symbol so large that it no longer fits inside his own skin. And symbols are easier to aim at than shadows. By late 1956, the war has shifted. The KLFA is still dangerous, still capable of bloody surprises. But starvation, hangings, detention, villagization and sheer exhaustion have shrunk the force. British intelligence has improved. Paths once known only to hunters are now etched on military maps. In this shrinking world, time becomes Kimathi's most ruthless enemy. He knows the British are planning another focused push in his area. He has maybe weeks, maybe days, before a dedicated operation tries to decapitate what remains of the Forest Command. So he does something many later find shocking. He begins quietly to consider talks. Not surrender, talks. He sends feelers through intermediaries, sounding out whether there is any space for negotiation that would not involve parading him in chains as a trophy. The answers are vague, then harsh, then vanish. Loyalist intermediaries tell him one thing. British officers tell them another. Some messages are never delivered at all. Some are delivered to the wrong person, for a price. Kimathi is trying to crack open a door in a wall designed never to open. At the same time, he refuses to loosen military discipline. If anything, he tightens it further, knowing that a single act of undisciplined brutality could ruin any hope of political sympathy. Fighters grumble, "We are starving and hunted," and still he behaves like a headmaster with a cane. In a way, he is. The boy who once argued with teachers has become the strictest teacher in the harshest school imaginable. One cold night, as the mist settles thick among the trees, Kimathi lies awake on a bed of branches and mud, listening to the forest breathe. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Closer, an owl calls. He runs the war through his mind like a ledger. Sectors lost, sectors holding. Commanders dead, commanders still moving. Villages broken, villages quietly defiant behind the wire. He wonders, not for the first time, whether history will see any of this, or whether the official story will say simply, "There was a disturbance." It was contained. He does not know that years later, his face will be on statues and banknotes. He only knows that dawn is coming, and with it another day of walking, deciding, hiding. Somewhere below his ridge, in the tangled bush near a place called Kahigaini, men are already moving. Some wear uniforms, some wear tattered clothes like his. Some have his name on their lips for very different reasons. The deadline that has been chasing him since the state of emergency was declared is almost here. Not the deadline of a speech or a meeting. The deadline of a single bullet, a moment of carelessness, a snapped twig in the wrong patch of grass. Kimathi pulls his threadbare coat tighter. 48 hours, he once told himself, to build an army. Now, without quite knowing it, he is down to something far smaller. A handful of nights, a handful of choices, a handful of steps between the commander of a barely surviving army and a wounded man on the ground, staring up at a sky he has rarely seen without leaves. He closes his eyes, whispers a prayer not for himself, but for the land and the people whose future he has tried to drag, bleeding into existence. Then he stands, shoulders the rifle that has replaced the chalk of his youth, and walks deeper into the dark. Toward a meeting he does not know he is already late for. It takes 1 bullet and 3 inches of bad luck to turn a field marshal into a case file. Not a heroic last stand, not a blaze of gunfire. A single shot in the dark, at the wrong height, at the wrong moment. By the time the first light stains the trees around Kahigaini, Dedan Kimathi has already lost the war that matters most. The war to stay invisible. He thinks he is moving ahead of his men. In reality, he is walking into a space already stitched with unseen eyes. Home guards and colonial police have crept into the ridges in the night, guided by people who know the paths as well as he does. Some of them once swore the same oaths he wrote. Now they carry British rifles and the promise of reward money heavy in their pockets. The forest, which has hidden him for years, betrays him with something small and ordinary. A rustle, a shift of weight, a flash of leopard skin where the undergrowth thins. A finger tightens on a trigger. The shot cracks the morning open. The bullet finds his thigh, tearing meat, shattering the illusion of invincibility more cleanly than bone. He falls, suddenly, stupidly human-sized, into the wet grass, still clutching the rifle whose serial number is now a piece of courtroom. Evidence waiting to be logged. For a heartbeat, there is only pain and the wild animal fury of a man who has spent years staying one step ahead of death. Suddenly, feeling death's breath on his skin, then they are on him, boots in the mud, shouts in English and Kikuyu, hands tugging at his arms, his cloak, his hair. Some of the faces looking down at him are young enough to have been in school when he first went into the forest. Some are old enough to remember when he was just Wachiuri, the argumentative clerk, not field marshal. A few don't look at his face at all. They look at the leopard skin and the captured rifle, calculating the size of their reward. They tie his hands. They lift him roughly, then drop him just as roughly onto a makeshift stretcher. Someone, whether out of cruelty or caution, steps on the wound by accident. He gasps, but he does not scream. As they carry him, the sky above the trees seems lower than it has ever been. The man whose orders once shaped whole sectors of forest now has no control over the simplest thing: the direction in which his body moves. It is the first time in years that Dedan Kimathi travels without choosing the path. The journey out of the forest is a grotesque reversal of his life in it. Villagers who once smuggled food to ragged fighters now stand at doorways, watching silently as the famous rebel passes, bound and bleeding. Some eyes are full of fear, some of pity, some of a hard, bitter calculation. If they see me looking sympathetic, will someone report it? At one stop, a home guard lifts the corner of the leopard skin cloak with the tip of his rifle and laughs. "This is the man who thought he could defeat an empire," he says, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Look at him now." Kimathi looks back at the man, not at the gun, and says nothing. The silence lands like an insult sharper than any words. When they reach the road, the smell changes. The damp, living scent of the forest gives way to petrol, dust, hot metal. They push him into the back of a lorry, the boards rough under his torn leg. The vehicle lurches into motion, carrying him toward a place he has always fought at a distance. The world of papers, laws, and men, who kill with signatures instead of guns. He has less than 4 months to live. The British schedule of death will be precise where his war has been improvisation. In hospital, they clean the wound not out of mercy, but out of procedure. A man must be healthy enough to stand trial before he can be killed respectably. He lies on a narrow bed, surrounded by white walls and the smell of antiseptic. An alien world to someone who has slept for years under branches, breathing smoke and wet earth. A guard sits nearby, rifle against his knee, watching even as Kimathi sleeps. The irony is almost funny. The colonial state, which denied him legal existence for years, now guards him fiercely as state property. A dangerous asset awaiting formal disposal. News of his capture spreads faster than any courier could run. In detention camps, some men fall silent, staring at nothing. In emergency villages, whispers ripple through huts at night. They've taken him. Is it true? Was he hurt? Will they hang him? In settler clubs, glasses are raised, toasts made. The old boys finally nabbed the bandit chief, someone says, as if recounting a successful hunt. In a small house somewhere under the wire, a woman named Mukami hears the rumor and feels the floor tilt beneath her. She has carried the weight of loving a man who belongs more to a cause than to a family. Now she carries the possibility that her children may soon belong to a country that calls their father a criminal. The British prepare what they call justice. The charge is carefully chosen. Unlawful possession of a firearm and ammunition. Not rebellion, not treason. Something neat, specific, technically sound. The colonial government wants his death to look like the application of law, not the execution of an idea. In the courtroom, spectators crowd the benches. Some are officials taking notes. Some are loyalists eager to see the myth reduced to a man in a dock. Some are Africans whose reasons for attending will never be written down. Curiosity, hatred, admiration, fear that silence will later be interpreted as disloyalty. When they bring him in, limping, the room inhales. He is thinner than the posters. His hair is matted, his uniform patched, his leopard skin cloak more worn than any statue will later show. But his back is straight. The clerk reads out the charges. The words rattle around the high room like stones in a tin can. Possession, without lawful authority. 38 caliber revolver. To the British, these are the important facts. To Kimathi, the important fact is that the gun they are talking about is the same kind of weapon used daily to enforce the very laws they now invoke. He pleads not guilty. The trial is a theatre in which the script was drafted long before the curtain rose. Witnesses are called. Home guards describe the ambush, the shot, the capture. An expert lifts the revolver with gloved hands, explains its workings as if the jury has never seen one. Documents are produced, numbers recited, the chain of evidence laid out with the precision of a parade drill. The defense tries to argue that the circumstances of the war, the state of emergency, the nature of colonial rule make the charge. Absurd that the entire legal framework is tilted like a rigged table. But the courtroom is not built to hear that argument. The walls are thick with the assumption that British law is neutral, even when every African in the room knows whose weight it rests upon. In the dock, Kimathi watches, listens, measures. He understands exactly what is happening. He has spent years constructing his own parallel system of laws in the forest. Codes, regulations, punishments. Now he stands inside the rival system, the one he has challenged. The two legal worlds do not argue. They simply deny each other's validity. The judge retires. When he returns, the room stands. The verdict is delivered in a voice as controlled as a firing squad. Guilty. Death by hanging. There is no gasp. No chaos. Just a faint exhalation, as if the building itself has been holding its breath for days. For the British authorities, the sentence is a triumph of order. The most wanted man in the forest will not die in a firefight, where martyrdom is too easy to claim. He will die in a prison, on a timetable, with forms filled in triplicate. Civilization, they tell themselves, has prevailed. For Kimathi, the sentence is a confirmation of what he has always suspected. That real power is often exercised not in the forest, but in rooms with polished floors by men who never have to see the blood their decisions draw. Outside, the war does not stop because one man has been sentenced. Operations continue. Villages remain under wire. Fighters still move, still ambush, still starve. But something has shifted. The psychological center of gravity has been dragged into a cell. In the weeks that follow, time becomes both his enemy and his only possession. Days are counted not by raids or council meetings, but by routines. Waking to the clank of keys, the shuffle of feet in the corridor, the arrival of food that tastes of tin and resignation. He writes when he can. He prays. He remembers. Sometimes he argues with an invisible adversary. A government that insists it is bringing progress. a rival commander whose disappearance still aches like an unclosed wound, a future Kenyan elite he has never met but already distrusts, fearing they might accept land and positions in exchange for forgetting the forest. He is no longer competing with Stanley Mathenge for command of an army. He is competing with something far more elusive. The story that will be told about this war when the guns finally fall silent. Will they call it banditry? Will they call it terrorism? Will anyone, years from now, remember the starving boy in the detention barbed wire whispering Uhuru to himself in the dark? The deadline approaches like a train you can hear but cannot see. Officially, the date is set, signed off, scheduled. Unofficially, rumor and hope twist together around it. Petitions, appeals, whispers that perhaps London will intervene, that perhaps international opinion will soften the noose. No such reprieve comes. On the morning designated by the state, the sky over Kimathi prison is indifferent. Inside, the air is tight with the metallic smell of fear. A smell the warders have grown so used to that they no longer notice it. They come for him early, chains, footsteps, a corridor that has swallowed other men and never returned them. He walks as far as the chain will allow. Some say he is calm, some say he is defiant. Memory, even among witnesses, is a partisan thing. There are stories, impossible to fully verify, of last words spoken with the clarity of prophecy, that he refused the Christian chaplain's offer of a prayer for his soul and instead prayed for Kenya, that he declared the land would be free even if he never saw it, that he forgave his executioners and condemned the system that produced them. What is certain is simpler and more brutal. A hood, a rope, a drop. The man who turned the forest into a parliament of the dispossessed dies in a concrete room, his body reduced by official language to remains. They do not give those remains to his family. The colonial authorities fear what a funeral could become. A rally, a shrine, a spark in dry grass. So they bury him inside the prison in an unmarked grave, as if the earth itself could be persuaded to forget. On paper, the problem is solved. Within a year, the KLFA is effectively broken. The emergency grinds on, but its fiercest symbol is gone. Settlers breathe a little easier. British politicians point to a diminishing number of incidents and talk about progress in restoring order. What no one can see yet is that the clock has started ticking in another direction. The very tactics used to crush the rebellion, mass detention, torture, forced villagization, have created a generation of people for whom the word empire will forever taste of wire and hunger. You cannot rehabilitate that memory out of them with lectures on the benefits of civilization. And so, quietly, inexorably, the center of the struggle shifts from the forest to the conference table. By the early 1960s, men who fought the war with speeches and petitions sit down with men who commanded the war with rifles and statistics. Political negotiations accelerate. The word that once got you locked up for sedition, Uhuru, moves from whispered prayer to official agenda item. In 1963, the Union Jack comes down. Kenya is independent. But here, in the story of Dedan Kimathi, comes a twist as sharp as any ambush. Independence does not instantly make the Mau Mau warriors official heroes. The new Kenyan government, anxious to present itself as stable, orderly, responsible, is wary of the image of wild-eyed forest fighters. It wants to reassure foreign investors, to calm former settlers who have agreed to stay, to prove it can govern with suits and constitutions, not with oaths in the dark. Mau Mau remains banned for years after independence. Some former fighters come down from the hills to find that their war, which cost them limbs, years, minds, is being pushed to the margins of the national story. They receive no land, no pensions, no parades. They are told, politely or bluntly, to move on. In Nairobi, roads are named after politicians, not guerrilla commanders. School children learn about negotiations in Lancaster House, about constitutional conferences, about the wisdom of statesmen. The name Dedan Kimathi circulates in a strange half-light, honored in songs and whispers, ignored in official ceremonies. It is as if he has been buried twice, once in the unmarked soil of Kimathi, once in the careful narratives of a young state trying to distance itself from the raw violence of its own birth. Yet the dead have their own kind of patience. In emergency villages turned ordinary settlements, old men gather under trees and talk. They speak of the days when a man in a leopard skin cloak appeared at night, demanding food, demanding discipline, promising a future. They can now watch on the news, but cannot quite touch. In prisons where former home guards and ex-fighters sometimes end up side by side for unrelated crimes, arguments break out over who betrayed whom. The past refuses to stay politely historical. It keeps leaking into the present. Meanwhile, in Britain, the emergency becomes a footnote in school textbooks. If it is mentioned at all, files are locked away, some are lost. Others sit in boxes, waiting for a future in which their contents will embarrass the grandchildren of the men who wrote them. Decades pass. Kenya changes. Presidents come and go. Economies rise and wobble. A new generation grows up in cities, more familiar with traffic jams than with forests, with smartphones than with rifles. And slowly, the official attitude toward the Mau Mau shifts. Historians dig. Activists campaign. Survivors speak on record. Their memories raw, contested, impossibly vivid. Stories of beatings, castrations, electric shocks, systematic torture in detention camps begin to seep into courtrooms and newspapers. In London as well as Nairobi, the legal facade of the emergency, polished so carefully during Kimathi's trial, begins to crack. Old men and women, stooped now, bring lawsuits against the British government, demanding recognition, compensation, something more precious: acknowledgement. In 2013, in a London courtroom, a British lawyer stands up and says words that would have been unthinkable in the year Kimathi died. She expresses regret for the torture inflicted during the emergency, speaks of compensation for survivors. It is not enough. It is late. But it is something. Back in Nairobi, the city's skyline has changed. Glass towers where once there were low offices, highways where there were dirt roads. Amid this, almost 50 years after his death, a bronze figure rises on a concrete plinth in the city center. Leopard skin cloak, rifle in one hand, a book in the other. The statue of Dedan Kimathi stares down a street choked with matatus and office workers, his metal face caught in a permanent expression of focused defiance. At his feet, schoolchildren in uniforms take pictures on borrowed phones, laughing, pushing each other, trying to fit entire histories into a selfie frame. Some of them know the bare outline. He fought, he was hanged, he is a hero. Fewer know about the arguments under the trees, the rivalries, the codes, the compromises. Almost none know exactly where his bones lie. Mukami, his widow, grows old still asking for what should have been simple: the right to bring his remains home, to mark a grave with a name rather than a rumor. Her request hangs between governments and bureaucracies, between archives and unmarked soil. In the end, perhaps the exact patch of earth matters less than the way his story keeps refusing to be completely controlled. To some, he is a terrorist who embraced violence. To others, he is the purest symbol of resistance to land theft and racial rule. To many, he is both at once, dangerous and necessary, flawed and vital. The man himself, if he could step again into the dusty heat of modern Nairobi, would probably be bewildered by the banknote versions of his face, by the ceremonial speeches invoking his name, not because he did not believe in the future he fought for, but because he knew, more intimately than most, how compromise and power warp even the noblest ideals. He might stand at the edge of a traffic island, look up at his own statue, and think of the boys he sent on raids who never came back, of the villagers beaten for hiding food, of the rival commander who vanished into rumor, of the judge who spoke his death sentence, as if announcing the weather. He might ask quietly, what did we win? What did we lose? And who is still paying the price? What is certain is this: the British never did quite manage what they tried to do in that unmarked grave at Kimathi. They never made him disappear. He lives in the tension between a state that once feared acknowledging the violence of its birth and a population that refuses to forget. He lives in songs sung under breath and in serious documentaries, in whispered prayers and in loud political rallies, in the way the word freedom tastes in the mouth of someone whose grandmother was once herded behind barbed wire. On the ridge long ago, under flares and darkness, Dedan Kimathi gave himself 48 hours to build an army. He failed, and he succeeded. He did not drive the British out with that army. He did not live to see the flag he dreamed of. But he and those like him forced an empire to confront the cost of holding land that had learned how to say no with a gun as well as with a petition. The man is long dead. The forest has thinned. The emergency villages have grown into ordinary towns. Yet every time someone in Kenya argues about land, about justice, about what kind of country this is supposed to be, they are, consciously or not, stepping onto ground he helped to shape. In that sense, his deadline never really arrived. His 48 hours stretched, through pain, through concrete, through decades of silence, into a question that has not finished being answered.